Okay. I do need to get a charter for this, but...
Oh, good. Rabbi Avi Orlow, Struggling with Vulnerability, Reish, Lakish, and Contemporary Jewish Life. We're going to post the Makarot. We're going to post the sources online as well. One of the great creative, pluralistic educators of our time. Rabbi Orlow, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. I know this doesn't help the people at home, but I just want to go around and see who's here. Say sort of a question to think about as we're going around, besides your name, in any institution you may or may not be connected to. Think about a time that you experienced vulnerability, and think about a time that you actually showed up, and like you actually showed up with all of you. You don't have to share the vulnerable one, but share like sort of when you show up. So my name is Avi. I work at the Foundation for Jewish Camp, and I actually really feel like I get to show up when I get to teach. So this is a great joy for me. So,
my name is Rafi. I go to Rutgers University, and I think I show up when I pray.
My name is Abby Pograbin. I'm a writer, and I'm also in the lay leadership at Central Synagogue. I think I just finished 3 years as president of Central. I showed up by listening a lot.
okay.
My name is Yehudit Mazur, and I think the institution I'm mostly connected to is probably Pardes and Limud FSU, where I do show up to teach, to my great pleasure.
My name is Ido Haklai. I go to Brandeis University, and I need to think about.
Great.
Nothing comes up at the moment.
Great. Let's see if this works again. Tell me if it's online a little bit. You can figure that out. So we're not going to go through all the Mar Makomos here. It's just, but there's a bunch here. There's a lot in this class that this is already a cut down class. But I want to introduce us to the character of Reish Lakish and who he is. I'm not even going to cover the first source here. It's really the sort of, he depicts him as the Kaiser Sose of the Gemara, that he really is like a badass, and we really are introduced to him as a gladiator, that he is he's a person who fights in the gladiatorium, and he's a fighter, and that's who he is. And this sort of, you can read the first text yourself. I sort of rediscovered him amidst a sort of a blitz of reading of all the writings of Brene Brown, all of her writings on vulnerability. You could read her, watch her TED Talks; they're great. Read her books, Daring Greatly and Rising Strong and Into the Wilderness. Great books on sort of. She's a professor of social work, So she says, just to get us in the space of what Brene Brown's going at, someone just read source number 2 here for us. Anyone English?
I'll read it.
Please.
Citizenship in a Republic.
Yeah.
President Theodore Roosevelt, April 23rd, 1910. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
So this is this is actually where Brene Brown gets the title for her book Daring Greatly, is from this quote, and it's a wonderful quote. It actually depicts like very much what you imagine the gladiatorium looked like. It's like it doesn't matter the people in the cheap seats; it's the person who's actually struggling out there, and they're gonna suck, they're gonna fail, and it doesn't matter. That's where the action is. So it's just sort of, I think, a wonderful depiction of sort of who the life of the gladiator is. So now we get to reintroduce ourselves to Reish Lakish. So someone read source number 3 here. It's a story from Baba Metzia. So take it away. You can read it in English, it's fine. If you're following in the Aramaic or Hebrew, you'll pitch in on top of that, but that's great.
All right, Baba Metzia. One day Rabbi Yochanan was bathing in the Jordan when Reish Lakish saw him and leapt into the Jordan after him. Said he, Rabbi Yochanan, to him, "Your strength should be for the Torah. Your beauty," he replied, "should be for women. If you will repent," said he, "I will give you my sister in marriage, who is more beautiful than me." He undertook to repent. Then he wished to return and collect his weapons, but could not. Subsequently, Rabbi Yochanan taught him Bible and Mishnah, and made him into a great man.
So if we were sort of doing the storyboard of this, or like if they made the movie, which I'd love to see this as a movie, you have this sort of wonderful image of this beautiful body across the river and this hulk of a human being, this sort of like superhero of a man sort of leaping across, and then sort of like sort of an interesting gendered moment when what he thinks is a form of a female is actually the form of a male, and he is surprised, but still it's scintillating. It's sort of very interesting in that level. If you want to read Boyarin's take on it, you should. But that's another chapter. So there's this moment here, and he says your beauty should be used for certain causes, and you say your strength should be used for certain causes. And there's sort of a handling of sort of like, can I lure you into my space? And he says, well, if you come into my zone, I have a sister who's more beautiful than me. And then sort of he lures him into the Beit Midrash. And then sure enough, what ends up happening here is not only at the end you see he sort of teaches the Bible and Mishnah and becomes a great man, meaning that Reish Lakish is brought in by Rabbi Yochanan into the Beit Midrash and becomes a great person, not in the arena of the gladiator, but in the Beit Midrash. But notably, right before that, you see something interesting, which is already in that moment, 1 second he's an avenger jumping across the river, and the next minute he's sort of taken in by Rabbi Yochanan, and he cannot even lift his sword. Like, he cannot pick it up. Now, this could be a commercial for a little blue pill, but I'm not making that assertion here. I think this is something, there's seemingly something else about sort of where is he getting his strength. We're going to come back to the Gemara and Baba B'tzi in a second, but I wanted to sort of, what does it mean to be a great man? I just whipping off the Gemara in Sanhedrin here. Can someone read the Gemara in Sanhedrin?
I can read it.
Please.
And Ula said, one who saw Reish Lakish in the Beit HaMidrash, engaged in debate, would think that he was uprooting mountains and grinding them against each other.
So what's interesting is even when they're depicting him in the most bookish of book spaces, here we are in the Beit Midrash ourselves, right? And you sort of have the image of Hans and Franz, sort of like, where are the heavy books? They're over there, like this like huge guy. But he even there in sort of a place of intellectual space, the way they choose to depict Reish Lakish is that he's still the avenger. He's still this huge gladiator of a human being, and in this conceptual space, he's lifting up mountains and grinding them up, right? So even in that space, what does it mean to be a Gavra Rabbah? What does it mean to be a great man? In the Beit Midrash, he was still a great man. But he's still he brought with him all of his sort of signature masculinity, signature strength, and he's still that person, right? So we go back to our heroes back at Baba Metzia. We're going to keep on going on here. Kids, take us through with source number 5 here.
Now one day there was a dispute in the Beit HaMidrash regarding the status of a sword, knife, dagger, spear, handsaw, and a scythe. At what stage of their manufacture can they become ritually unclean? When the manufacture is finished. And when is the manufacture finished? Rabbi Yochanan ruled when they are tempered in a furnace. Reish Lakish maintained when they have been fabricated in water. Said he to him, a robber understands his trade. Said he to him, and wherewith you have benefited me. There as a robber I was called master, and here in the Beit HaMidrash I am called master. By bringing you under the wings of the Shekhinah, he retorted. Rabbi Yochanan therefore felt himself deeply hurt, as a result of which Reish Lakish fell ill.
Okay, so there's a lot going on here. So there's a discussion in the Beit Midrash, seemingly an academic discussion about when is the utensil of a knife complete? When is it finished? And they're having this discussion. It seems the most academic of discussions of Tuma, Tahara, purity, impurity. When is it finished? And they're going back and forth. So Rabbi Yochanan says when it's tempered in the furnace, when you put it back in the oven and you finish it, that's when it's finished. And Reish Lakish says no, when you put it in the water, right? That's when you sort of, I think, right?
That's where he was furbished.
So say more. That's exactly where this is fascinating. So this is the story right after that story. So what's the imagery here?
The same as himself is the kind of relating. He is the sword. The sword is an image for himself, and he was like he became a kosher Jew in a way by his interaction with Rabbi Yochanan or his encounter with Rabbi Yochanan in the river. So the same as he became a righteous person through water, so does the sword becomes kosher through water.
Right. So there's clearly a double entendre going on here, which is sort of like, are we talking about the swords, or are we talking to the people? But there's the place that, if metaphor gets pierced in a minute, when Rabbi Yochanan says the robber knows his trade. Right? So there's a jab here, sort of like, so there's a prohibition of reminding a Baal Tshuva of his or her past. And this is a moment when he sort of goes right at it. And he said, well, you know about knives. You know about knives. Like, you know that world. Meaning we in the Beit Midrash don't know about, that's like, we don't know about knives. You know about a knife. And that reminds him of his old life. Right? But it doesn't just remind him of his old life, it actually...
It insults him.
Insults him, but there's actually a consequence of this insult.
Of course.
It's actually the insult. This insult yields to a fight, which yields to him saying, "No, you are nothing." He said, "I'm nothing." Out there in the gladiatorium, I was a master, and here I'm a master. You might be master in here. You're nothing out there. Like, I'm really the master. I'm the Gavra Rabbah. I'm the man. Like, all puns intended. I'm the man here, and you're not. And they said, "No, you. I brought you in under the wings of the Shekhinah, notably a feminine aesthetic here, and he's sort of like, in all of your masculinity, I brought you into the femininity, like I brought you into this space, and that actually leads to Reish Lakish dying, right?
And then Rabbi Yochanan dying.
That's even later on. I'm saying
on.
this later on. But what's interesting in this sense is, I think what I want to hold up here, which is fascinating, you have a guy in Reish Lakish who is routinely facing death in a gladiatorium and has no fear. And is impervious. Impervious, right? Impervious in the gladiatorium. He is kicking everyone's butt. Somehow you schlep him in, or you finish him off, right? You finish his kli, like he becomes a whole utensil. You bring him to the Beit Midrash, and you could say one line to him that I know who you are. I know who you are. And that pierces his armor, right? That gets right through to him, right? So it's as if Achilles, you go right for the heel. Like, you got one little area that is uncovered, and it's nothing that you can touch with a knife. Ironically, that's the thing. It's like that's what kills him.
You can also look at it from Rabbi Yochanan's perspective. Like, he's as if his world doesn't have violence, it doesn't have aggression, and he lives in this holy sphere. But in this story, he becomes the violent person. He becomes the aggressor.
Yes, in his saying, "You are the robber. You know that space." We don't know of violence. You know of violence is the most violent thing he could say. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the moment he pierces his armor. And it sort of strikes up a lot of issues in my mind. So here I brought some quotes from Brene Brown because I think they're really interesting and compelling. I think it's to hold up to our story of Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish here. Shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear that we're not good enough. Right? The fear that I am not good enough. Right, so in the gladiatorium, he knew exactly if he was good enough. You live another day, right? But his whole life in the Beit Midrash, he lived with a fear of shame, of maybe I don't really belong here. Maybe this is not my space, and I'm walking around with shame. I'll skip ahead to number D here. Brene Brown on vulnerability. Vulnerability is about showing up and being seen. It is tough to do that when you're terrified about what people might see or think, right? So, vulnerability, it's like really being there and showing up and being your whole person. But the reality, it's really hard to do it. And it's very interesting to think of sort of who is the Baal Tshuva, who is the person who is sort of coming from outside to the inside, who is always bringing that shame with them, the imposter syndrome. They're always the outsider. And it's sort of, they can never really show up because they're always bringing shame along with them. It's hard to practice compassion when you're struggling with our authenticity, or when our own worthiness is off balance. It's really hard to sort of, the role of the Baal Tshuva is really difficult because they don't ever really feel like they belong there. They're always feeling like they're on the outside and they never really can show up. I think the person of Reish Lakish is interesting in many levels, on many moments of history. I think it sort of speaks to a challenge a Baal Tshuva always will feel. So here we are, sort of the enterprise of Jewish education, saying, how do we bring more people into the Beit Midrash? Are we not asking people to be incredibly vulnerable to come into the Beit Midrash? Meaning here you take the strongest human being of his generation, and you say, oh my God, he was so strong, he could come into the Beit Midrash and grind up mountains. But ultimately that's where he got mortally injured, was when he actually came into the Beit Midrash. It might have been where he was finished, Maybe it might have been when he became a complete self, was when he came into the Beit Midrash. He was tempered in that sense, but also might be when he was most vulnerable. So, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I think specifically, like, in the Beit Midrash, that's a place where you have to be open and be vulnerable, like, to your own emotions and your own thoughts, because that's what you're doing. You're engaging with your thoughts. It's like you're like he's smashing mountains in the sense that he's being vulnerable. So it's like everybody's like sort of being more open in a Beit Midrash.
So yes, 100%. And it's interesting, sort of like what are our, like you can imagine the gladiator has all this protective armor, and then it's sort of in the place of Beit Midrash, what is the protective armor? Like if it's strictly sort of brain to brain or spirit to spirit, like where can I hide here? Like you're really out there and you're really sort of vulnerable in that space. And I think if you read more of Brene Brown's work, it's really like vulnerability is the foundation for real growth. Vulnerability is the foundation which you could do innovation. Vulnerability is the space where you'll really grow. And that's, I think, why Rabbi Yochanan wants to lure him into the Beit Midrash, is to make him a better person. But we want to recognize that there's a lot people have to give up, to go that place.
Yeah.
And so like the enterprise of saying, oh, woe is me, why don't Jews know more about what it means to be Jewish? It's like, well, because maybe we make them feel like crap when we tell them to come into a place that makes them vulnerable. As opposed to actually what happens when we actually talk about, hey, there's a thing called being vulnerable, and actually it's high-risk proposition, but we think you're up for the challenge.
Right.
Like high yield, high risk, but join us. Just putting it out there. I want to sort of change the frame another moment because we have a couple more minutes here. So we read in Elul, we see this Tehillah all the time. This is a part of this Tehillah we say. I messed up the word Psalms, and evidently it's not how you spell it. Okay, so someone read this source number 7 here. Go ahead.
One thing I ask of the Lord, that I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to see the pleasantness of the Lord and to visit God's temple every morning. That God will hide me in God's tabernacle on the day of calamity. God will conceal me in the secrecy of God's tent. God will lift me up on a rock.
So I think there's something interesting, which is the images that we are, throughout Jewish history, that we've basically had our tuchus handed to us throughout history. Sort of the image of the Jew is sort of like we've been at the brunt of it. And so we hear this psalm which we say all the time, it's like, oh my God, the one thing I really, really want is just like remove me from the calamity. Just take me out of the gladiatorium for 1 minute. Just like get me away from anti-Semitism. Just like get me out of the cycle of violence. Stop making me so vulnerable. God, can you just take me in? The one thing I want is to not sort of just take me in. And at the same time, we're being brought into that sanctity of space. So juxtapose that to source number 8 here, where Moshe is saying, show me, I pray you, God, show me your glory. God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim the name of Lord before you, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy unto whom I will show mercy. And God said, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and you shall stand on the rock. So it's interesting. The one thing I want is to be this intimacy with God, because everyone's trying to kill me. I want to get out of the gladiatorium. The one thing I'm asking is sort of intimacy with God, which itself might kill me. Right? So I want to sort of leave the page for a minute and actually think about sort of where we are in history. I think, at least since the Holocaust, it feels so much like, especially with our energy around sort of the state of Israel, is how do we remove ourselves from the state of vulnerability? And that we've recreated ourselves as a gladiator in history, that we've seen the worst people could throw at us, and we've survived, and we've survived, and we've survived. But in many respects, we are so brazen on our survivalism that we have shirked away from often stripped away from an openness to spirituality, an openness to actually being in that house of God. Actually, can we imagine the time? And I think about this all the time. My kids, before Pittsburgh happened, I was preparing to tell my kids, remember that story called anti-Semitism? Then sort of like we reverted back to our gladiator selves of sort of remembering all the calamities that befell us. But what does it mean for us if we could imagine a world without anti-Semitism, to imagine a place where we would push ourselves to be vulnerable again, but we'd have to pursue that in the Beit Midrash. We'd have to actually pursue a theological stance of being vulnerable because we weren't actually suffering from a physiological state of vulnerability. And I think the person of Reish Lakish actually holds up that sort of duality of how do we move from the challenge of surviving to the challenge of thriving, to really get to the place of wanting to actually say, I want to make myself vulnerable. I want to open myself up and potentially get wounded in this circumstance, but in that space I will actually grow. Because it's not this place of gladiatorium, it's the place of the Beit Midrash. I think a lot of that is invested and challenges some of our notions of gender identity, or gender roles at least, in some interesting ways. But I think back to the question I asked at the beginning, when I were to ask each of us to say what's a moment we felt vulnerable versus a moment we showed up, right? It's easy for me to look at the nobility of Reish Lakish's life in different ways that I'd see his own vulnerability if it was my vulnerability, which is to say, source number in Brene Brown's number C here. The difficult thing is that vulnerability is the first thing I look for in you and the last thing I'm willing to show you. In you, it's courage, in daring. In me, it's weakness. So I can see in Reish Lakish a certain daring, a certain boldness to actually say, you could leave the gladiatorium behind and enter the Beit Midrash, right? But for himself, it was a mortal weakness that he couldn't see it himself, right? So how do we allow ourselves to exist in environments where I can see your daring and your vulnerability as heroic, but I could also even see the same behavior in myself the same way? It's so hard. It's so hard.
It's an everyday challenge. You don't have to face anti-Semitism for this. It's an
Completely.
everyday challenge, which reminds me always also about this dilemma that I think is very close. Like God is consuming fire, and then cling closely to God. So how do you do this to a completely opposite thing? Same here.
I was just saying, I think you're 100% right on a personal level. I was toggling out to a national level. So I think that sort of the national level is an interesting moment when we say to ourselves, who are we? I would say if you ask most Jews today, they understand ourselves as a people, not as a religion.
Okay.
And I think that is invested in a notion of we are the survivors of the gladiatorium,
Right.
not the beneficiaries of a struggling vulnerability at a Beit Midrash.
Sure.
But I 100% agree with you on a personal level. This is the constant tension of sort of how do I allow myself to show up and be vulnerable at a God that I'm not even sure exists, right? Like how do I sort of say that in the 21st century of saying like it is a vulnerability in a modern age to say I am struggling with an idea of a God that is actually simultaneously inviting me in and simultaneously might be crushing me at the same time, or burning me in the case that you're saying. That's the personal struggle. And I'm also saying that sort of as a national struggle, it's really compelling and challenging, which is to say, which is our narrative? Which is the narrative we...
Are we past the notion of survival, you mean?
And what would it mean to actually open ourselves up and be vulnerable to a notion of... I'm thrilled with the notion that Jews have different religions, but are we open to that discourse? And that we sort of could have a post-survival discussion around how we disagree about our theology. That's a national thing, not a personal thing. Anyhow, so I just think that I think Reish Lakish sort of opens a lot of this stuff up for me as a person, me as a man, us as a people, to sort of hold that tension together about what does it mean to often the places I think I'm vulnerable, I'm not, and the places that I am not vulnerable, I am. and sort of how can they hold themselves together. I think we're good on time. Any other thoughts or challenges?
I guess I'm challenged by the fact that I see that we weaken each other. So it's not just that we can't find it individually, but that sometimes we are undermining each other's not just strength but entitlement to be at the table, so that in some ways the vulnerability is, it's hard to be vulnerable when someone is kind of disenfranchising you. Does that make sense? That there's like, you're not as Jewish as I am, you don't know as much, you don't have as much entitlement to have an opinion on whether it is theology or survival or Israel or any of it. And so that, in some sense, I think the splintering, the internal splintering, leads to, not the best kind of vulnerability. A defensiveness that makes us almost have a false strength, to present a false strength.
I would push your comment even further in my mind. I work in camping, and I am blessed to see people at their happiest. It's not just people at their happiest; it's people in their most unapologetic state. Right. So I get to see Jews living full lives in their own imagination, what Judaism ought to be, without apologizing to anybody. And in my mind, that's the difficulty of being vulnerable in those spaces and actually showing up in those spaces without yielding the floor to someone else. So I hear what you're saying, which is, does someone else take my authenticity away? I'm not sure authenticity is something that someone can give you. It's something only you can take for yourself. And I feel like so often, so too many times in our communal discourse, we yield the floor to someone else. Someone else is more authentic than me, as opposed to, this is how I do Shabbos, how do you do Shabbos? But I've never heard that sort of pushed really the full extent, which it could be. But I'm saying in my work, I get to see it every day, which is people say, oh my God, I don't have to ask the mean part of that question, but I'm living unapologetically in a way that sort of means I'm in that space that's so beautiful, which is I'm in the space of vulnerability where I can show up. And I'm showing up unabashedly, and I don't have to apologize to you about that. And I feel like if everyone could approach the world that way, we would still be disagreeing violently. As is the place of the Beit Midrash. Right, as is the place of Beit Midrash.
It's not about disagreement. Correct,
but I'm saying, but in that space, it's not saying, oh, you're a robber, you know the trade, as opposed to, I know knives better than you know knives. What happens if he imagine the whole conversation in reverse, and he said, you know what, I know knives. Maybe can you imagine? I'm saying, imagine the whole story of Reish Lakish the other way around. He says, oh, we don't know about knives. Let me tell you something. I know about knives, and let me tell you when the knife is really finished. Totally different conversation. And how is it that we could have a communal discourse where someone could say, you don't know guitar playing, I'm a Reformed Jew, I know guitar playing better than anybody. I'm saying, that moment we say, I do my thing best to the benefit of everyone else, not to the exclusion of anyone else.
Or superiority.
I like superiority. My favorite image, and I just share this, is a classic image which would explain my commitment to, an image to explain my commitment as an Orthodox rabbi to pluralism, is the classic image of Muhammad Ali standing over Sonny Liston. And it's the second time they met, and he's pumping his fist, he's saying, I'm the greatest, and he's saying, get up. Sonny Liston was the best boxer of his day. And Muhammad Ali was the second fight, he went down way too early. And Muhammad Ali wanted everyone to know he was the best fighter in the world, but only would work if Sonny Liston got up and fought. So I like competition. I just want everyone to fight their best game so that the person at the end of the match can say honestly that they are the best, not that anyone lied down to give them the match. Please.
Maybe another idea, we can also look at these texts on top of this distinction between the survivalist element and the vulnerable element of Beit Midrash as exemplifying two perceptions of what religion is. Is religion the place we escape from our vulnerability to? Is religion our cure from vulnerability? A place like in the Psalmist, where all our questions are answered and we don't need to be vulnerable or insecure. Or we can see the Beit Midrash and religion as a whole as that place for vulnerability. And the essence of religion is that it gives you these questions that you're struggling with, and the essence of how you connect with God is not by Him allowing you to have the shield against vulnerability, but allowing you to be vulnerable.
Right, so I think in many ways that image of Achal Shatimet Hashem is to say, how do we get away from the gladiatorium, but actually make ourselves even more vulnerable in the Beit Midrash? And what would it mean if God were the question, not the answer?
You still have a few minutes. I'm just going to let them know to come down for mincha, and when we come down, that'll be the
Great. I would just say that in that sense, what do we understand? That God is not the fundamentalist approach to block out the world, but God is a fundamental question to open us up to the world. And I think that's sort of a interesting reading and rereading of the Tehillah. There is that religion is not an escapism, right, from the world. It's sort of a way just out of the world. It's a way from the bad parts of the world, but it's also a way to make us show up better in the world, to actually be vulnerable in it. And
I like the interpretation, but I have a hard time finding it in the text.
Chachat Temet Hashem, meaning I was reading the psalm of it saying, put me up on the rock, in the context of the last text, which is actually saying, the rock might be the place that you actually might be destroyed by God. That's why I didn't say it, so now I'll say it. Meaning, so what does it mean that I actually want to go to the place away from the people who are trying to attack me, to be lifted up? But that might be the very place that I actually, oh great, I get to be with God, but that's the God that could actually burn me up. That's the same rock. Does that answer that?
Yeah.
So in any case, I just want to sort of lift up Reish Lakish as sort of a, whether it's a personal national paradigm for us to sort of hold up that tension about how do we show up to be our best, and how do we come to grips with the vulnerability that it might take for us to show up and be our best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
There's going to be an mincha in about a minute in that room.
Yeah. Sure.